installment of Sharper Focus Wider Lens. And Sharper Focus Wider Lens is a project at the MSU Honors College that really tries to create spaces for transdisciplinary discussion. The reason that that's really important is because the fact that often we get fairly siloed in academic life and don't spend a lot of time talking to other people, frankly, that can really illuminate the kinds of things that are of interest to us. So in Sharper Focus Wider Lens, we try to bring very diverse panels together to really be able to have them spend time with you and with each other. First of all, we're going to have presentations from the five. Then we go for a little bit of crosstalk on the panel if anyone wants to amplify anything. And then we open it up for discussion of the audience. My name is John Beck. I'm your moderator tonight. It's my pleasure to coordinate the Sharper Focus Wider Lens program. I'm actually a professor in the School of Human Resources and Labor Relations here at Michigan State. Tonight we have a wonderful, very, very diverse panel in terms of their backgrounds and in terms of their viewpoints on this whole notion of questioning technology. I want to start off tonight, though. I was reminded when I was getting ready for tonight, first of all, that we didn't have a single English major up here besides me. I was an undergraduate literature major here at Michigan State. But I thought that I would put out, just as a framing device, a poem by Richard Brodigan from long ago that was either a piece of technological optimism on the one side or technological cynicism on the other. But either way, I think it might be an interesting framing device for tonight. It was written in the 1960s when Brodigan, who was very famous for a little slim novel called Trout Fishing in America that one reviewer said, oddly enough, had nothing really to do about trout fishing. But he had been poet in residence at the California Institute of Technology in 1966-67. For those of you who weren't born, like many of us on this panel were, in the post-World War II baby boom era, there was a great amount of technological optimism and a belief, I think, that technology, that we were going to land on the moon, that we were going to conquer the stars, that if there was a social problem that existed, that technology would do something with it. So let me just kind of frame the panel and introduce the panel members, our questioning technology panel, with this very short poem by Richard Brodigan called All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace. I like to think, and the sooner the better, of a cybernetic meadow where mammals and computers live together in mutually programming harmony like pure water touching clear sky. I like to think, right now please, of a cybernetic forest filled with pines and electronics where deer stroll peacefully past computers as if they were flowers with spinning blossoms. I like to think, it has to be, of a cybernetic ecology where we are free of our labors and joined back to nature, returned to our mammal brothers and sisters, and all watched over by machines of loving grace. Richard Brodigan. So let me introduce tonight's panel for questioning technology. And by questioning technology, we have a lot of different meanings for that, as you'll see. Starting on my right and then moving to my left, Dr. Lawrence Larry Busch is a University Distinguished Professor of Sociology in the College of Social Science and Director of the Center for the Study of Standards in Society at Michigan State University. He has been on the faculty at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, Lancaster University in the United Kingdom, and what is now the Institut de Recherche pour le Développement in France. Dr. Busch is co-author, an author or co-editor or editor of 12 books. He has also authored or co-authored more than 150 other publications. He is past president of both the Rural Sociological Society and the Agricultural, Food, and Human Values Society, a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, a Chevalier d'Ordre de Mérite Agricole, and an elected member of the Académie d'Agriculture de France. He received a doctorate honoris causa from the Universidad Universidad Técnica de Lisboa in Lisbon. Dr. Paul Thompson, on my immediate right, is a philosopher, professor in the College of Arts and Letters, and the W.K. Kellogg Chair in Agricultural, Food, and Community Ethics in the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Dr. Thompson is the author of 13 books and editions and co-editor of The Agrarian Roots of Pragmatism. He has served on many national and international committees on agriculture biotechnology and contributed to the National Research Council report, The Environmental Effects of Transgenic Plants. Dr. Thompson is a past president of the Agricultural, Food, and Human Values Society and the Society for Philosophy and Technology, and is secretary of the International Society for Environmental Ethics. He has continuing interests in environmental and agricultural ethics. Dr. Tobin Craig, on my immediate left, is an associate professor in James Madison College here at Michigan State. His studies focus on the intersection between modern political philosophy and modern science and technology. Dr. Craig teaches in both the political theory and constitutional democracy field and the science, technology, environment, and public policy specialization. He is currently working on a book-length study of the unity of Francis Bacon's scientific and political thought, as well as a study of the place of technology in American political thought. On Dr. Craig's left is Dr. Logan Williams. Dr. Williams is an assistant professor in Lyman Briggs College here at MSU and in the Department of Sociology in the College of Social Science. Dr. Williams' research and teaching investigates the political economy of sustainable development with a topical focus on innovation from below, technoscience circulation, appropriate technology, technological choice, entrepreneurship, and civil society. She desires that her work improve policies for science, technology, and international development. Dr. Williams has published in the following journals: Minerva, Technology and Society and Perspectives on Global Development and Technology. Her work has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the Council of American Overseas Research Centers, and the Smithsonian Institutes. And last but not least, over on my far left, Dr. Erik Goodman is a professor of electrical and computer engineering and of mechanical engineering of computer science and engineering in the College of Engineering. He's also the director of Beacon, an NSF Center for the Study of Evolution and Action here at MSU. His research deals primarily with developing new ways of using evolutionary computation to solve problems in engineering design. In 1999, his research colleague, Professor Ron Averill, and he founded a spin-off company, Red Cedar Technology, to make the design automation technology available to industry. Dr. Goodman has been awarded the university's highest teaching award, the Alumni Club of Mid-Michigan Quality and Undergraduate Teaching Award, as well as a Michigan Distinguished Professor of the Year Award from the President's Council, State Universities of Michigan. I think we're going to have a very interesting discussion tonight. We are going to start with Dr. Busch and move on down the panel this way. My job is to be obnoxious as can be to the speakers and make sure that all of them stay within their time limit, and so that we'll have adequate time to discuss among the panel and with you this whole issue of questioning technology. So let me start with Dr. Busch.
Okay, well, a pleasure to be here this evening. What I'm going to talk about today is standards. And let me assure you, this is the most boring topic that you've ever come across. So if you'd like to get 5 or 6 minutes of shut-eye, this is the opportunity to do it. Now, what I'd like to begin with is to ask you all, how many of you checked the seats that you're sitting on to make sure they would hold you before you sat down? How many did that? No one. Why not? Well, because those seats are standardized. Because you sat in thousands of seats that are almost exactly the same height, that have almost the same load-bearing capacity, and so on. Okay, now of course, there was a time, not that long ago, and there are places today in the world where you won't get these kind of standardized seats. And in fact, in 1530, Erasmus of Rotterdam, the philosopher and theologian, wrote a book on manners for 8-year-olds. And one of the things he said was, before you sit down, make sure that no one has fouled your seat. okay? He also had a whole series of other suggestions he made, which involved creating a new set of standards, which to us are so taken for granted we don't even think about it. So, for example, he suggested that, that it was inappropriate to just pick things off a serving plate and stick them in their mouth. That you should use the spoon. Forks were just coming into being at that time. Use the spoon, put it on your plate, or your tranche, that is to say your slice of bread, and eat it from there, but not to just pick it off the plate when you felt like it. Okay, now, most of the things in this room that you're looking at here are standardized, right? The lights are standardized, the tiles on the walls are standardized, the carpet's standardized, the electricity is standardized, the clock on the back wall there is standardized. We live in a world which is entirely, or almost entirely, standardized, which is really quite extraordinary. And what standards allow us to do is to habitualize certain aspects of our lives so that we can concentrate on others. So, for example, if every time you came in the room, you had to make sure that the tiles weren't going to fall off the wall, that the lamps weren't going to fall down off the ceiling, that you weren't going to, when you touched the light switch to turn the light on, that you weren't going to get a shock. If you had to do all of that, you'd never get anything done. So standards are extraordinarily effective. Now, most of you think of standards in terms of standardizing. But what I want to suggest is this fellow, H.J. Heinz, who most of you know for ketchup, came up with this idea of 57 varieties of pickles around 1890. Now, it wasn't that he created more varieties of pickles, he narrowed the variety of pickles from thousands and thousands of different sizes and shapes, and from jars of pickles that would contain pickles that were 6 inches long as well as ones that were this big. Heinz said, no, I'm not going to do that like my competitors. I'm going to have pickles of different sizes and shapes with different means of fermenting them in different bottles. And when people go, they'll know if they like Heinz gherkins, those are going to be identical from jar to jar. And he made himself a millionaire as a result of that. And then, about 50 years later, this fellow Sloan, who ran General Motors, said, well, you know, I could do the same thing for automobiles. So here we had chaos in automobile production around 1900. By 1920, we had Henry Ford, who would produce a Model T or a Model A for you, any color as long as it was black. And we have Sloan who comes along and he says, no, that's not where we're going to do this at all. We're going to have Chevrolets, we're going to have Cadillacs, we're going to have Buicks. We're going to have all these different kinds of cars which will come in multiple colors with multiple features, all of which are standardized. Now, an example of how far this has come, this is just one that I could pick up quickly. This is a catalog of light fixtures. And I can't put the mic down easily here, but if you look through there, there's just hundreds and hundreds of different light fixtures. And you and I can either use a catalog like this, or we can go, say, to a website, and we can see literally thousands of different light fixtures, and we can say, well, you know, I like that one, that would be really nice, or no, I don't like that one. And when we order it, the chances are that it's going to be exactly what we expected it to be, because they're all standardized. We won't have to worry when we get it that, oh my gosh, this thing uses bulbs that are non-standard, so there's nowhere we can find to put the bulbs in it. Or this is wired for 262 volts. There isn't any place where I can get service of 262 volts. This isn't going to work. Okay, all standardized. So standardization on the one hand can be used to standardize, on the other hand to differentiate. Now, standards also have winners and losers, and I want to show you here an example. And John is not very surreptitiously getting there to tell me soon I have to stop. But here are two signs. You've probably seen these signs before. And I suspect that if you saw these signs, that almost everyone in this room would know exactly where to go when they saw the signs and when they needed to go. The catch, however, is that about 1 in 100 people don't quite fit the standard definitions. for male and female. These are definitions we wrote into the language, but they're not definitions that happen to agree with the way the world is put together. These 1 in 100 are intersexed, to use the current terminology. That is to say, they may have ambiguous genitalia, whatever ambiguous might mean. They might have ambiguous genetics, XYY or XXY, or they may have medical conditions of one sort or another that, as a result of them, create that problem. So, standards, in short, make realities. There are winners and losers in standards. These chairs that you're sitting on are perfectly fine if you're of, quote, average height and weight. If you're too heavy, you'll probably break the chair. If you're too short, you'll have to sit up in the air. Okay, so to give you a final example here, and then I will shut up and move on here. There's a big battle going on right now over whether genetically modified food should be called natural. Grocery Manufacturers Association say, well, of course it's natural. It's made out of utterly natural biological stuff. And the critics say, no, it's not natural at all because it involves moving genes from one plant species to another, and there's nothing natural about that. It's done with us. Okay? Now, we're not going to resolve this debate, but I want to emphasize how, regardless of how the debate gets resolved, there will be winners and there will be losers. Of most concern to me, we don't have the time to talk about it this evening, but of most concern to me is that none of these things involve very much in the way of public participation. There are millions of standards that control, in many ways, structure your everyday life, and yet, for the most part, you and I have absolutely no input into how those things are done. Thank you.
And again, we will be open for questions and discussion later, so we're just going to go down the panel. So now we'll hear from Dr. Thompson.
So I'm going to stay put and see if I can be even more boring than Dr. Busch. I actually want to start out, John reminded me, talking about baby boomers, which I am one, that I got interested in my particular line of research by hanging out with a fellow who just passed away last week on a beach in Long Island. His name was Pete Seeger, and Pete and I were singing protest songs to protest a nuclear power plant that was operating on Long Island at the time that I was a graduate student. It wasn't just me and Pete. I mean, there were a couple of other thousand people that were actually between me and Pete, but we were singing together nonetheless. And partly as a result of some of that activity, I got interested in what we now call emerging technologies, these technologies that come along and seem to forebode really significant changes and that often spark a lot of resistance and concern and debate. My particular approach to this was to focus on risks. The way that we pick up on Dr. Busch's presentation, we actually have standards for how we approach risk in government regulation and in terms of policy decision making. And I really started getting interested in the way that some of the ways that risk had been standardized for the purpose of regulatory assessment really didn't fit very well with the way that risk seems to function in ordinary thought and conversation and decision making. And I've actually noticed this running throughout virtually every area of emerging technology which has come along since nuclear power. Genetically engineered foods, nanotechnologies, now we're having synthetic biology on the horizon. And in every case, we tend to approach the risk assessment for this technology with an approach that understands risk as really combining two elements. One of them is what the risk assessors will call the hazard. That's the bad thing that can happen. And the second is the probability or the exposure, the likelihood that this bad thing is going to happen. And if you hang out with risk assessment types, they will tell you that you don't have a risk until you have both an account of the hazard and the probability that it's going to happen, and they'll also tell you that risk is pervasive. There's nothing on Earth that doesn't involve risk. And what I want to suggest is that this definition, which I don't object to, it overlaps in some important ways with the way that we normally think about risk and talk about risk, but it does have some important points of difference that have led us to some of the quandaries that we face in terms of thinking about these emerging technologies. And the first one I want to point out is that in ordinary language I just mean non-technical speech, people who might be having a conversation over a beer or a cup of coffee or a bridge game or while they're driving to work or on vacation. Just ordinary conversations. When the word risk comes up, it's important to notice that it can actually function as a verb. You can risk things. You can risk your money. You can risk your life. You can risk your children's lives. And whenever the word risk is functioning as a verb, it almost always ties the potential for something bad to happen to some notion of responsibility. And this is something that's been completely eliminated from the technical assessment of risk. A risk in a technical assessment is the likelihood that something bad is going to happen, but it's in no way connected to any sense that anyone might be responsible for it. Indeed, some of the bad things that you can do a risk assessment for, nobody would be held responsible for. But in ordinary conversation, one of the ways that the word risk functions is to already get us to start thinking about who might be held responsible and what sorts of steps might be taken. Second thing is that in ordinary conversation, risk actually functions to divide our world into things that it's not really worth spending too much time thinking about, and things that deserve much more careful consideration. The former things we don't really consider to be risks. Risks are things that we need to think about more carefully. Risks are things that we need to maybe think a little bit about what some of the hazards are and what some of the ways that they might materialize. But this sense in which it would be odd for you to, if you go home tonight and talk to a family member or roommate and ask them what they think the risk of boiling peas on the stove is. They'll look at you with a funny expression, right? Because boiling peas is not something that we think of as risky. Clearly there are bad things that could happen if you boil the peas. You could burn them, you could start a fire, any number of things, but it's just not something that's risky, right? To think of something that is risky is to already be down the road of, well, let's think about what we could do. Let's think about who could be responsible. So there's been this odd sense in which in technical risk assessment for nuclear power or genetically engineered foods, we send this off to a bunch of either engineers or biologists or physicists or whatever, and they will do a study of what the hazards are and how likely they are to occur. And sometimes they'll come back and say, there's no reason to worry about that, right? So then you go out into a world and you say, we're going to talk about the risks of nuclear power or the risks of genetic engineering. And if you're in an ordinary language frame of mind, you're already thinking, hey, this is something that I need to be paying attention to, and there might be somebody who could be held responsible. The mere fact that you're talking about risk has already set up people, and then they say, oh, but don't worry about it, right? So then you say, well, why are they telling me not to worry about this? They must be hiding something, right? And you actually get this kind of loop where the fact that you've actually done a technical assessment of risk is one of the things that's leading people to think that there may be something fishy here, something that needs to be taken into consideration. Now, I don't want to say that that's all there is to say about any of these technologies. I was, after all, out on the beach with Pete Seeger protesting nuclear power, but it's become quite interesting to me to look at the way that the process of actually doing a standardized technical assessment of risk runs counter to the way in which we think about risk in an ordinary sense. I'm all done.
You're all done. We're saving time up here. This is wonderful. And again, we're going to come back to all of these different threads and try to see how they hang together. I think you already see a kind of a progression in relation to this whole notion of linking, on the one side, standards perhaps and risk, and how we actually view things. I think it's very, very important. So let me now turn it over to Dr. Craig.
Well, thank you. I'll try and steal some of that time back. For my part, what I'd like to do is to take the occasion to reflect for a moment on what I'll call, for lack of a better term, our two-mindedness about technology, and to do so through the example of the currently in progress revolution being wrought in our lives by the cluster of digital communication technologies. What I have in mind could perhaps already be inferred by the title of the panel, Questioning Technology. On the one hand, aren't we all doing an awful lot of questioning of technology? It's astonishing how much technology talk there is about the newest and latest electronic device or app or biomedical breakthrough or energy production technology. Press conferences held, ad campaigns launched, discussion groups held, dinner party conversations stimulated, and of course much academic research conducted, colloquia organized. It would seem that there's no shortage of technology talk, some of which might amount to genuine questioning, though of course most of it is mere chatter. And this points to the other hand, that we don't really do much questioning of technology, that we seldom reflect on how deeply, comprehensively, and irreversibly our lives, both at the political and personal levels, have been shaped, even transformed by our technological innovations. In my experience, it's quite remarkable how quickly discomfited people tend to be by having their unreflective appropriation and use of a new technology questioned, by having their dependence on some relatively new device pointed out to them. How shocking and even revolting is the suggestion that perhaps certain new and beneficial technologies ought to have been turned down, or horror of horrors, regulated in advance because of corollary costs. So while on the one hand we can't stop talking about technology, on the other hand, and somehow at the same time, we seek to avoid really thinking about technology. This is surely what led the Heideggers and the Ellul's and the Marcuses and the Postmans to point out over and over again how uncanny our radical openness to technology is and how little real thinking about technology we do. What explains this, our openness to technology? Now, drawing from those thinkers who have taken up this challenge to reflect on our relationship to technology, allow me to draw out 3 points in particular that might help shed some light on this question. First and most obvious, the goods or benefits opened up by a new innovation will always be clearer than the other consequences, and will always tend to blind us to those other consequences. Think of the first time you saw and held a smartphone or a tablet. Dazzled and thrilled by the prospects opened up by the new technology, it's new after all. I'll ignore for the moment the purely aesthetic appeal bound up with the wonder that they induce in us, and their place as status markers. The promise these devices offer is convenience. They promise to disencumber us, to make us freer. Quick, easy communication and access to information, not many devices tethered to one place, but one device that is almost completely mobile. Meanwhile, the costs, to the extent that they can be conceived, are bound up with what is now suddenly revealed as an unnecessary burden, and so are less striking. Take, for instance, the many goods that come from not being able to shoot off an email or text or tweet at any time and in any place. Moreover, because our situation without the device is familiar to us, we're easily tempted into believing that no great effort is required to preserve whatever goods we can still see in them. Yeah, sure, it could be distracting and keep me from focusing on whatever other important things I'm doing, but that's just a matter of discipline or self-control. I just have to buckle down and focus. Yeah, sure, texting instead of calling might lead to a loss of personal communication skills and confidence, to a brutalization of even our most intimate personal relations. I'll just correct for that. Yeah, sure, having a means to communicate always with us might lead to the disappearance of real solitude and the sense of independence and time for reflection that solitude brings. We can just build that into our day or develop an app for that. It's tellingly called the Freedom App. This leads to my second point. that we believe that with respect to our technologies, we are in charge, that we're free, that we can just pick up and put down our devices and remain otherwise unchanged. It's just me now with a smartphone. But in fact, we find that things aren't that simple. As the years go by, today one senses one can almost watch this happen month by month, we find our expectations have changed, and those we have of others and those that others have of us. How infuriating to not be able to get in touch with someone. How frustrating we find waiting. Or we suddenly find that being on social media and available by means of smartphone has somehow gone from an optional extra to an informal social expectation to a full-blown job requirement, which incidentally totally changes the so-called work-life balance. And so having opened the door, there is no going back. Of course, taking away a convenience that one has grown accustomed to is altogether different and harder than saying no to it in the first place. Compare washing dishes when there is no dishwasher to when there is a dishwasher but you don't have one, to deciding to give up or not use your dishwasher. A crazy move, by the way. And so then, whether we wanted to or not, we're obliged to recalibrate our expectations and refashion a whole set of other practices. As teachers, we're now frequently told that we cannot simply teach, quote, digital natives in the same way as we taught their non-native ancestors. Of course, this can lead to wonderful innovations, but surely we can recognize that it also has costs. This then leads to a third point, our sense or belief in the inevitability of technological change. When I challenge students on why, given what they know and have themselves experienced of the consequences of digital communication technologies, why they still remain so open and such receptive consumers of new apps, devices, games, and so on, one response I often hear is that there is no point to saying no, because individual choices don't matter. The choices of the aggregate will determine what happens. So if you can't beat them, join them. In Sherry Turkle's fine study, Alone Together, she interviews teenagers who wish desperately that they could turn off their digital communication technologies and opt out, but find that they cannot. Their lives would be over, as they like to put it. Some students go even further, arguing that critical questioning of technology is pointless, even for individuals or political communities, because of the inevitability of technological development or innovation. Often presented in terms of geopolitical security or economic competitiveness, be it global or local. I need the skills, I need the know-how. If Okemos kids have iPads in their classes, how can we possibly say no to iPads in the classes in East Lansing? These are, of course, all bad arguments, exaggerations based on half-truths. One could dismiss them as mere dodges, but I think we should also read such arguments, together with what preceded, a suggestion that we somehow wish to avoid the burden of choosing, which of course suggests that we think we can somehow get by without reflecting and choosing. Perhaps because there's nothing really to be feared, or perhaps because we think that problems will solve themselves. Ultimately, a lingering hidden belief in the automaticity of social progress driven by technological progress. A deep-seated hopefulness about technology whereby there's no real need to make decisions, let alone policy for technology. We are, in a word, technological utopians in denial. So what then? The paradoxes that I have pointed out are simply meant to point to some of the obstacles that stand in the way of serious thinking about technology, which is itself the precondition both for meaningful independence of mind and for anything resembling intelligent technology policy. And I think our moment is particularly propitious in this regard because many of us, and especially the young among us, have experienced firsthand the breathtakingly quick transformation of huge domains of their lives by means of technology. Questioning technology by no means necessitates primitivism or nostalgia, but what it does entail is that we start not from hearsay, but with what is right before our eyes. Thank you.
So now we turn to Dr. Williams. Well,
Can I use this one?
do you want me to hit it for you?
Oh, sure.
Are you, what button are we on? There?
Thank you.
Okay. We'll get out of that. Do that. And we'll do that.
Thanks.
No problem, and I'll be your finger. You just tell me when to do it.
Okay.
Lean back.
Okay, Dr. Williams.
Okay, thanks. So I thought that I would talk about appropriate technology, and this is based on research that I did in 5 different sites in the Global South. So when I say the Global South, I mean developing countries or less industrialized countries. And before I start, I'm hoping that you'll think about these 2 questions while I'm speaking. So what is appropriate technology, and who should decide global standards for surgery? And to give you a little bit of background, or maybe the biophysical context, there are about 40 million people who are blind due to avoidable or preventable causes. And what this means is that a lot of the science is known in how to treat these diseases, to restore sight, or to stop sight from further deteriorating. And 50% of avoidable blindness is actually caused by cataract disease. So does anyone in the audience know someone over the age of 55? Okay, so that means 1 out of 5 people over the age of 55 in the world are likely to get cataracts. That just means that the natural lens of your eye gets cloudy. And the typical standard surgery here in the United States and in other Western or industrialized countries is to remove that cloudy natural lens and to replace it with a plastic intraocular lens using a medical ultrasound probe called Phaco. So just keep that in mind, because I'll be talking about that a little bit more. So like I said, I did this work in 5 different sites. One was an NGO here in the United States that works in the Global South, and the other 4 were in India, Nepal, Kenya, and Mexico. And so as I went through these different sites and saw what they were thinking about in terms of how to treat cataract disease at this large scale, this large problem of 20 million people around the world, I saw that they had different models. The first model that I saw more or less could be described as the import of high technology. This means that in places in the Global South, perhaps the local doctor, the local ophthalmologist had an affiliation or relationship with an ophthalmologist here in the United States, and that ophthalmologist here in the United States had donated a phacoemulsification ultrasound probe, and that probe may have been used in the clinic in the Global South. Unfortunately, what happens oftentimes because of lack of infrastructure, non-regular electricity sources, those phacoemulsification machines would break, and there was not necessarily the resources to repair it or even a trained technician available to repair it. And so once they're broken, they can no longer be used. Similarly, in other places, the problem might not have been so much the infrastructure, but the lack of trained surgeons in order to do the surgery. And so what would be done is to fly in a surgeon from the West, and they would come and they'd perform the surgery, but since they're only there for a short time, you can't build local capacity. And so a second model that I saw frequently can be kind of described in terms of that nonprofit organization Unite for Sight, which was started at Yale University by an undergraduate student there. And they send United States volunteers, typically students, to Ghana, Honduras, and India. And they actually develop a limited amount of local capacity, because what they do is they pair up over a long amount of time with a local clinic, and they send money to pay for the surgeries for poor people. They also send donated eyeglasses that have been collected here in the United States primarily. And in that sense, they're providing a more sustainable sort of model for treating people with avoidable blindness, maybe subsistence farmers who really have no way of providing for themselves and their families in Ghana or India or Honduras can have their disease treated and be able to see the same day and go home and continue working and supporting their families. A third model that I saw was exemplified by the other 4 sites that I traveled to, and it started in South Asia. And this model was kind of a little bit more complex. So what happened is that the doctors in South Asia, primarily in Nepal and India, first looked at how to reach the unreached, meaning those same subsistence farmers typically who are in rural areas, how to go out to them and bring surgery to them. So specifically in the Himalayan mountains, they do outreach surgical camps. So they looked at the logistics for that. And also, they looked at the surgery itself. So they said, okay, well, these phacoemulsification machines, they're a little bit impractical for us. We don't have consistent electricity sources, and also we're doing surgery in the mountains. We need something that works a little bit better for our situation. And so they reinvented surgical practice. They went from the expensive medical ultrasound instrument to a manual technique. Manual just means that the surgeon does not require the medical ultrasound instrument. And they were able to modify the surgical practice and actually make it available to treat advanced stage cataracts. So you'll find that the subsistence farmers won't actually necessarily reach out to anyone about their health problems until they no longer can actually see at all. So whereas here in the United States, when we start having a little bit of cloudy vision, we can go and talk to our doctor and we can have cataract surgery and go on about our business. The subsistence farmers either don't have access to doctors, or they don't necessarily see the value in reaching out to doctors, and so they'll wait till they absolutely cannot see before they go and seek surgery. And so the surgical practices that were developed in South Asia, though, they're a little bit different than what we do here in the United States. And in fact, you'll see multiple patients in the surgical ward. You'll see multiple patients per surgeon. The surgeon will sit on a little stool on wheels and go back and forth between two beds as the nurses lead in patients. It's sort of an assembly line model. You'll see that they don't change gloves between surgeries. You'll see that the instruments they use are different for every surgery, and so they are assured, because of their high volume and because of the tests that they've performed, that they have low rates of infection and yet are able to provide a high standard of quality care for their patients. So this just kind of helps us think about what does it mean for surgical standards, kind of thinking about what Larry and Paul were talking about, how much risk is acceptable in terms of the Western standards for surgery and the standards being developed in South Asia that presumably they say are okay, and what does it mean to question technology itself? Are the phacoemulsification machines that we're so used to really the best procedure for cataract surgery for everyone, especially since the procedure developed in South Asia is a lot cheaper? So that just kind of helps us think about some of the things that we're talking about as a panel altogether. Thanks very much.
Great. Where, oh,
You just push a button, I think.
oh, push the button. But where did the other?
And there's
there
the
it is.
button.
Look at that. Just like downtown, you have the technology and it goes well. Look at that. Okay. So now Dr. Goodman.
All right, thank you. I've got a very long pair of titles there. I want to just mention we're going to be using principles from evolution, which is what we do in the Beacon Center, and we're going to be looking at problems in developing countries and trying to look at bringing the environmental issues to bear in trying to address those problems. And we're doing that in a framework that we are developing that will depend on scientific models to help show the stakeholders what the trade-offs are that they're looking at among various things. And to talk about trade-offs, I want to first talk about a technical point, Pareto optimal solutions. Imagine that instead of trying to find the ideal solution to a problem where you have only one objective that you're trying to maximize or minimize, we're going to try and minimize two objectives. One might be destruction of the environment, one might be cost of implementing the plan, for example. And we've got a bunch of plans. Those red circles are various plans. Now, it will be a trade-off. Any solution is some match between a cost and an environmental loss, as it were. And we're going to try and minimize those environmental costs while we minimize the other costs. Now, to do that, I can't get a no, I can't get a cursor on there. So I'm going to go right over there briefly and point. Let's look at, oh, I should have been able to get a cursor. Let's look at this point and this point and contrast those. Which point has the lower environmental cost on that axis? Well, the first one, this one. Which one has the lower cost in terms of the implementation axis? Well, this one. This plan is better with regard to both objectives than this plan. There's no reason I would ever choose this plan over this plan. Now let's compare these two plans. This one, lower environmental damage, but higher implementation cost. This one, more environmental damage, but cheaper to implement. These two plans represent something where there's a trade-off, right? There is a real trade-off available between those plans. And one stakeholder might say, you know, we have to do one that is over here because otherwise, whatever's important to them. Another stakeholder would have some different set of preferences, views, coming from their values, coming from what their expectations are. So, looking at that set of solutions, though, I don't know which one I want, but I'll tell you what, I don't actually want any of those solutions. Those were generated, in fact, at random. The plan inputs were generated at random. Let's watch what happens if I optimize those solutions. I'm going to, I changed the axes a little bit, but now you see all those solutions are lined up along that line that's called the Pareto optimal front. What it means is that all those older solutions that I had that were away from that front are all inferior to all of these solutions, but relative to each other, each of these solutions represents a trade-off. But they're all optimal in some sense. They're all better than any other plan on that axis with regard to one thing, and they're worse with respect to the other thing. Okay, now I'm going to bend your minds. It bends my mind. In our plans that we're looking at for economic development in developing countries, we have not 2 objectives, but 14. Oh, so now we just go from this two-dimensional view to looking at it in terms of, well, in 14 dimensions, we can see that we can't see anything in 14 dimensions. We don't work that way, okay? We can get to 3, right? We're not bad at 3. All right, so why do I have all this? Well, here's the problem. We've got a lake, and it's surrounded by the farmland owned by the indigenous Maori people. This is in Rotorua, New Zealand, and they grow sheep, beef cattle, dairy cattle, trees, all kinds of things around that lake. Some of those things, like the dairy operation, put a great deal of phosphate, nitrate runoff into that lake, and they're causing algal blooms and they're ruining the lake. That ruins the whole local economy. It's the big tourist attraction for the whole region, and people are not happy about it. But in contrast to the old days, the government can't just go in and say, you won't do that anymore, you will grow no more dairy cattle, because these people are protected, as they should be. So now the government needs to go in and negotiate. Well, on what basis do they negotiate? Well, the traditional basis is power, money. We're doing this, you're moving. That's the traditional economic development model in much of the developing world. They're not going to use that here. So we have worked with them to quantify not only the environmental impacts, we have 5 variables for environmental impacts, but we have a number of variables for the various kinds of things produced, beef, lamb, wool, these kinds of things, and also variables for profitability and for the cost of changing the use of a piece of that land from one use to another. We have numbers for all of those kinds of things. They're in a series of 14 computational models. Okay? So, what we have to do is try and satisfy the triple bottom line. We need to have a balance between the economic things, for which we've got models, and the environmental things, for which we have models, and the social things. for which we do not even think of having models, okay? It's hard. So the way we want to satisfy the social side of things is by bringing the stakeholders to the table and letting them explore this space of all of these 14 objectives conflicting against each other, bringing to bear the preferences, the values, in fact, of the groups that they represent, and then trading those off, negotiating. And, of course, well, I'll save that for a second. There's just a diagram of the various kinds of things that we're modeling, the 14 objectives. Here's a look at the landscape. The lake is now in your upper left. This is just a typical view where we've color-coded each of the 315 different patches or paddocks according to its use. So blue is dairy, and green is forest, and there's lamb and wool and all these other various things. What we're trying to do is now do a Pareto optimization in 14 dimensions. This is not easy to do. That's why we're doing it here in our Center for the Study of Evolution in Action, because we're able to do it, and so far other people have not been able to. So it's a breakthrough to be able to address a problem like that. And to do that, we use virtuality, or to explain these results to the stakeholders, we use virtual reality kinds of tools like this, where each of those points represents a solution. To the people watching, it looks like this, actually. It's only one side, actually, but they're in stereo, so you can see what's in front of what and so forth, and explore those things very quickly. So we're using some high technology, and we come up with a set of points. Here's a set of solution points. Okay, and here's a set of solutions. Here's an environmentally friendly solution. We've got three axes, kind of environment, profitability, and productivity here, and points at various places on them. So here's what those 14 outputs look like over a 50-year time frame when we make all the changes within the first 10 years, and then we see what happens. And you can see that certain things are going down, other things are going up, according to this particular plan that was environmentally friendly. Another plan, and here's what happens during that plan. Each year, you're seeing the changes that will be made in 1 year in that plan, and you see the dairy is disappearing from around the lake. That's a very good thing. Then the runoff, in fact, as you see now, here's 11 through 50, the dairy is all isolated from the lake by forest, which can take up those nutrients that are running off into the lake and put it into trees, which are a valuable forest product and not damaging the environment. So this is an example of a plan. Here's another plan. If we look at something that gives us more profitability, that first plan wasn't very profitable. The outputs are different. What results after in years 11 through 50, here's on the left is the more profitable one, and the right is the first one we saw that's more environmentally friendly. And you see there's a big difference between what it turns out sheep and beef production is the big difference between those plants. Also, there's a lot less dairy on the left, surprisingly enough. We hadn't anticipated that. But the stakeholders can look at these things, and they decide what they want to do with them. The final point I'll make is that when they look at these models, the first thing that they're going to do is what? What are they going to do?
What am I going to gain? What am I going to lose?
Yeah, and they're going to question the models. They're going to say, wait a minute, your technology is telling me this. I don't believe it. So the first thing you have to do is be ready to react to those questions, revise the models, put their assumptions in, and do it all again. Okay, I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Erik. So we've heard 5 different presentations, and together we've heard things about technological decision-making in a variety of different ways. We've heard from Dr. Williams really a question that could be asked of any of the panelists, which is really what technologies are appropriate, or what makes an appropriate technology? What are the values that go into it? I think that we just heard from Dr. Goodman about the idea of using technology in a way to free people to help with decision making. But we also heard from Dr. Craig that beware of the whole notion of how we get sucked in by the technologies where they suddenly become an unbelievable part of the fabric of our lives, and we cannot do much or seemingly do much without them, or we no longer question the appropriateness of them. So with that, let me open it up first to the panel to ask questions of each other or make comments on each other's presentations. So the microphones are there, and then we'll open it up, and Stephanie is going to run around with a microphone and find out what is on the minds of our audience members. So does anyone want to jump in to discussion of what you heard from each other? Anyone want to?
Well, let me just say that what Paul was talking about, the risk and so forth, and in our models, we have to capture the nature of uncertainty of the models, and that is another face of the same concept. The risk is that the prediction of the model will be wildly wrong, and the actions that you've taken then will lead you astray as a result of that. And that is extremely important to assess, and people are singularly bad at assessing that, as you said.
Okay, other comments, Larry?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, and this is with respect to Logan's presentation, that I was really hit by the fact that what you described there is so similar to what I've found over the years in agricultural development projects. I've wandered around probably over my lifespan 35, 40 countries, and one of the things that you see all the time is entire laboratories full of broken equipment.
Yep.
And usually this is pretty high-tech stuff. Expensive. People spend a lot of money in supplying it. You also find it in other ways. I started my international career in Guinea, in West Africa, in the 1960s, and there was, just not too far from where I lived, there was a graveyard of tractors, buses, automobiles, and other things. These were all items donated by probably 30 countries' different aid agencies. This was at the height of the Cold War. So there was South Korean, North Korean, American, Japanese, Russian, Hungarian stuff, and none of the parts for anyone fit anything else. So even though if you had a mechanic, there wasn't a blasted thing you could do with the stuff.
They needed standards.
But they needed parts that were based on standards.
Yes.
Other comments? I think just one quick thing on Dr. Williams' presentation. I think that what Dr. Williams is really on about is that it gets us over the myopia that we develop. Sorry to talk about eye stuff that way.
It's the Sherpa lens, right?
The myopia that we get over being so Western-centric and so Northern-centric. That is, that much of what she's looking at is south-south transfer, south-north transfer in terms of technologies. One thing that was developed recently in Africa was the fact that with no spare parts for incubators for hospitals for newborns, they developed incubators made completely of used car parts. Because if you use headlights and a fan from the automobile and other things, you can create a perfectly good incubator. And frankly, there are a lot of dead cars that might be available to be able to take the parts from. Now, let me just ask Paul one quick thing, and then let's open it up. Paul, you raised the whole issue of nuclear power, and I heard just the other day on the radio some person going on and on about the fact that everyone's against nuclear power and more people have been killed by wind power, something going wrong with wind turbines or whatever. Does that get at that whole notion of riskiness being defined in the eye of the beholder, but also very much about assuming that something that is going to be almost science fiction is by its very nature more risky than things that we can actually get our hands on and understand?
Yeah, I think one of the things that, case by case, sometimes you can come up with good explanations, but we seem to have this we've got some kind of built-in filters for the kinds of things that we're going to react to through this frame of risk. And, nuclear power pushed all of our buttons, and genetic engineering pushed our buttons, and, some other technologies, Tobin was actually talking about some great examples, have kind of gotten a pass. Most of our information technologies have never really been even discussed in terms of the context of the risks that they pose, yet I think it's very likely that they've had much more transformative impacts on our society and our way of life, both for good and for ill, than some of these technologies that really soak up all the oxygen for thinking about risks. And it's curious. I don't know that anybody's got a good explanation, and some, little points here and there, but I certainly don't think anybody has it's kind of like your social sustainability point. Nobody really would venture a predictive theory of which next technology is going to push people's buttons.
Right.
Just to build on Paul's point and Tobin's point, actually, I just read, I think, on the MSU News website about how certain types of light that are emitted from devices people commonly take to bed with them, meaning our phones, that causes disruption to your potential sleep pattern. So basically, if you're taking your phone to bed or you're using your phone right before bed, you're less likely to get a good night's sleep. And yet we don't think about that in terms of technology choice or appropriate technology.
Okay. Why don't we have you all join the conversation? Stephanie's got the microphone. Please do put your hand up and jump in either with comments or questions.
I have a few comments. I was really interested in your talk about on the risk, and I was thinking that seems to be a lot of...
Would you just put the mic up?
I'm sorry. When you're talking about the risk, how much I know, like for farmers, there's a lot of in terms of the federal level, like the federal farm bill, that really kind of institutionalizes like risk management into only like a few very select winners, and there's not very much to explore other types of grains perhaps that would do also the same thing. And I think that losing that, the loss of risk, you're introducing more innovation would be at a larger social level would be also be very beneficial.
Right. Well, I think actually several people might speak to this, but there are a number of examples of places where we've introduced either policies or in some cases technologies that are intended to respond to risks and reduce risks. And they may be fairly successful with respect to a specific hazard, but they will have very dramatic effects, and food safety might be a great example of this, in that we have a variety of things that have been done in the food industry and in the fields in agriculture that reduce our exposure both to man-made or human-introduced hazards, chemicals and so on, but also natural hazards, microbes and disease organisms. But at the same time, because those to get back to Larry's point, because those risk control measures are highly standardized, and it's not even, you not only have to reduce the risk, you have to prove that you have reduced the risk. They become very costly, and they certainly create barriers to innovation. It becomes difficult to introduce something new, because you not only have to pass certain straight-up economic tests. Is this cost effective? Is it more productive? But you have to actually generate all of the tools to assess the risk of this new innovation at the same time, and that becomes very costly. I think one of the things that we've really seen with genetic engineering that surprised people in agricultural universities is that no public institution really has much of a chance of introducing any genetically engineered technology, simply because the costs of meeting the regulatory barriers are so high that only a fairly large, well-capitalized company is going to be able to move a product through the regulatory phase. So yeah, there can be a lot of reflex revenge effects that are associated with our attempt to control risks.
Other comments on the panel before we turn it over to the audience? Back to you, Stephanie. There's a couple of hands. There was a hand up here and one over here.
This question is for Dr. Williams. Did you notice, or if in any study you've done, that with the Western world, Europe versus the U.S., is it the same piece of technology that's been used, but the practice, I would say, is different? Have you noticed a difference in that, and is there sort of a social effect as to, or, a difference in how the patient care is handled when the same piece of technology is used in a different way, or even the West versus the India or the rest of the developing world? Have you seen a difference? I'm more interested in the Western world, and why is there a difference with the same piece of technology, if there is one? So if you could please elaborate on that.
Okay, sure. So when I first went to Nepal, I went there because I was specifically interested in Dr. Urit and his development of small incision cataract surgery. But as soon as I got there and I did my first observation of surgery, I realized that they were also using phacoemulsification, the medical ultrasound machines. And so my question then was, well, why? Because if they've already developed this technique, they know that it's safer, they know that it's cheaper, they know that it's faster, and they know that they need all of those things because they want to address this problem that's at such a large scale and they want to address it quickly. Why are they using medical ultrasound devices for treating cataract surgery? And what I found is that part of their model for cost recovery, or part of their model for economic viability, because it's not necessarily cost recovery the way that health policy people describe it here in the United States, is to have these tiers of service. And what that means is that they charge very high fees, thousands of rupees, for the medical ultrasound surgery, and they typically do this on patients with the less advanced stage of cataract, because these are the patients that are high income in a developing country, like India or Nepal, or sometimes people call India newly industrialized. But anyway, so the reason they do that is because they want to take those high fees to subsidize the cost for poor patients. So in addition to donations, which they're fine with accepting and that they use for their poor patients, they also use fees from high-income patients for their poor patients. And so that's one way I've seen the same device that we use here in the United States for treating the majority of our cataract surgeries being used in places like India, Nepal, Kenya, and Mexico, but used in a slightly different way than how we use it.
Okay, there's a couple up here.
I guess I can do it. Let me try without it. Okay. This subject is really...
Could you use the microphone for us, please?
Okay. I'm saying this subject is very dear to my heart because I'm not technology savvy, number one. Two, I'm an original researcher, and I'm following technology and its impact and the decision-making of technology. And I see a straight line, that is, we are going this way at the same time, and I'm talking about in many, many areas, including, for instance, the subject of cataract surgery. And we are ignoring the potential of so many other options that can be also considered, especially if you take crisis that's been happening. When we lost the power not too long ago, 2, 3, 4 years ago, I guess we lost the power in the summer. And in a second, and Katrina one of them, and in instant we go to the Stone Age, or before even. And okay, I kept saying, what is the alternative in case of disasters, in case of this, in case of that? Not only that, even technology is not even thinking, while there is straight line going, to say, okay, what can we, I'm a sociologist, an educator, and I look at it from a sociological point of view in the term of the masses, the people, and what is happening, like people who stayed 12, 13 days without power, without heat, without whatever. And in the eye, I explored, for instance, I did my own research on the subject to say what are really the alternative in case, you go and you do, and I start reading what is there a side effect for these technological, and of course, the patient doesn't know what is going to happen to her or him after a few years. And I found out some of it comes back again, and some of it even the sight is not as good as whatever it is. Of course, it needs more exploration, but yet there are natural alternatives that can be done, that can be explored. So what I feel the decision-making of technology and the people in charge should be aware of the vast potential. And you are talking about the third world and other countries, and they do have other alternatives, but unfortunately, the third world, according to the third world, the underdeveloped, whatever it is, of course, I spent years in this area.
Now, I'm gonna just to cut you off here if I can to let the panel respond. So you're really asking about, you're saying that there's a straight line and that there are alternatives, and I would challenge the panel to also talk. There were various points in the history of technology when there were alternatives, alternative innovations that weren't chosen. I mean, the development of the internal combustion engine here in Michigan in different cars that could have been done instead. So I mean, there at various points, the roads not taken, so to speak, paths not trod. And why don't we open it up to the panel and have them respond to that?
Yeah, but let me add to the third world. The third world is rushing to catch up with the West, unfortunately, and they are not looking at what they have, just like what this doctor mentioned, that they want to make profit. The profit, like in the case of the cell phone, the profit is, and I did teach the history of technology, and straight line you see, it is the profit margin is the key.
Okay, reaction panel?
Speak to the tracking.
I think your point's well taken. What I would say is just a couple of thoughts on it. First of all, I've spent most of my career associated with people doing agricultural research. About 25 years ago, a whole bunch of folks were involved in a major study of agricultural universities around the world. And we brought all the people from those universities, as well as a whole bunch of people from American universities, together in Washington for a 3 or 4 day conference. And I suggested that there were an awful lot of things that could be learned from some of the universities we visited. Now, of course, some of them were a disaster. There was no question about it. But I pointed out there were research trajectories there that were not being considered. And I can tell you that I was basically everything but shoved out of the room by the American university folks who were there. That was just simply not in the cards. It was this very linear model. We in the West have all the answers. What we need to do is give those answers to folks in the rest of the world. And I would say that there's a reciprocal side to that. I spent about 3 years on and off in India doing a study of the Indian agricultural universities, and I did this with an Indian counterpart who was a fascinating fellow. We had about 35 people involved, about half Americans, half Indians. And I remember I got to know him fairly well over that 3-year period. We were sitting together, and he said, I really wish India could be #1 in the world in wheat research. And I said, why? He said, well, that would be wonderful. I said, well, no, wait a minute. India has hundreds of other crops that nobody in the West is studying at all. You could be #1 in all of those things in terms of improving the productivity, the sustainability, and all the rest. And he said, I never thought of it that way before. So what I would argue is that this is a two-way street. People in those countries that are not developed see a single path to development. And I would argue that it goes whether we're talking about China, the former Soviet Union, or we're talking about the U.S. and Western Europe. There's this notion, and I think you're absolutely right, that there's a linear model, and by gosh, we're just going to go up the curve.
Yeah, I would just add to that and maybe poke a little bit at one of your asides, which is that it's driven essentially by the profit margin. I think now, not being able to speak about the developing world here, the developed world is astonishing the extent to which, precisely what you describe, an enthusiasm for the novel simply because it's novel, even as you're aware that by availing yourself of it, you've become more dependent and can't do without it. So that when the storm comes, eureka, here you go, I don't know how to do anything. And you're astonished to find this. Whereas if you had declined it and kept alive what now seem like burdensome practices, you'd be much more able to cope on your own and stand on your own. It doesn't, there's something here, our fascination with the novel and with the kind of the most technologically sophisticated and advanced, the most wonder-inducing, has a kind of pull of its own. And so I think it's true that in many cases, the big dogs do better in the world of high technology, but it's also the case that we, the consumers, are sort of complicit a little bit in this, it seems to me.
But let me challenge Erik a little bit. Erik, pick up on that, because you're dealing with the Maori in New Zealand, where you are attempting to actually have participation of all of the economic strata. Folks who, and so you're using technology actually to attempt to advance voice rather than retard voice, whereas we would see many times that profit margin has retarded voice or alternatives, as I think has been laid out. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, we're trying to use the notion of scientifically visible trade-offs as opposed to simply brute power in being able to make these decisions, so that people can't simply say this is the way it has to be, but rather they have to be able to talk about things on the basis of the trade-off that you're making between more of this and less of this. And the risk, of course, the difficulty that we run into is that people can question not just the trade-offs and what's most appropriate, but also the models that underlie those and the validity of those models, and that's a very legitimate thing to do. So we have to go into this with the notion that we're going to let them critique the models, disagree with the models, and now we're trying to develop technology to be able to use the cloud computing to be able to then recompute the models essentially on the fly, because otherwise, if we have to say, well, that's a very good point, we'll come back in 2 weeks and try and address that for you, that doesn't work for a negotiation. So we need to be able to let them say, all right, here's a plan. What if we change and put sheep over here? Okay, because well, then we want to be able to turn around and say, okay, let's put sheep over there, okay? Dun, 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 dun. Okay, now, with sheep over there, you get a point that's over here, and look, yes, you gained more sheep production there, but look what you lost. You lost this, and this, and this, and this, and this. And after you go through that a few times, then we hope, and in our experience, they get some confidence that at least the models have some validity. Now, when you start talking about the prices of what beef is going to do in 10 years from now, then what you have to do is you have to bracket things, right? You have to say, all right, well, let's say instead of, we said 5%, let's say 7%, let's say 3%. Now, what's the impact of that on what this trade-off is going to look like to you, on what you're going to want to do? And the other thing that we're saying is, this is a 10-year plan. You're going to start implementing things. And in year 3, you're going to turn around and come back to us and say, but this thing didn't get implemented, and furthermore, this didn't do what was predicted. And we're going to say, yep, come on back. Now we'll do the second 10-year plan 3 years later. okay? And this is realistic, I think, and we hope that people will respond to that. And still, what we don't want them to do is to throw out the science. That's the problem that's happening so often, is they just throw out all the science because it's very easy to find, to pick a bone with something, to find a problem with something, and then that's the excuse for throwing it out completely. Well, that's what we want to try and fight by allowing them to see all these trade-offs in a very visible way and be able to deal with them, be able to play with these models. That's the idea.
Okay, I saw, I think you had your hand up right here. And here comes the microphone.
Actually, I was taking notes, so I have comments and questions for everybody, but I won't dominate because other people have questions. The first thing that strikes me is the basic concept of the Beacon Center. I mean, we know from way back in Charles Darwin days that the environment affects evolution. So why are we not taking into account in human evolution the environment in India, the environment in Nepal? I mean, some places just, I mean, here in the U.S. we've been blessed with tremendous energy resources, land resources, air, water, fresh air, all kinds of stuff. They don't have that in Shanghai. You know, I mean, so I really think that has to be taken into account. Like genetically modified food, the people in China and maybe Japan, Korea don't even want to buy that stuff because they think it's dangerous. Europe is saying that they don't want it. So how about we listen to the participants, listen to the people who live there and say, what do you want, instead of just foisting our technology on them. There's so many things that have happened that, yes, there has not been much public participation, and do we, the taxpayers, really want to spend millions of dollars to store all that NSA gathered evidence? Maybe that's not a good idea. But people in the U.S. don't want to participate because it takes a lot of responsibility to pay attention that, like, how many people know there's going to be an election on February 25th? You know, I mean, not everybody does pay attention to these things. Not everybody wants to. We elect other people. We think there's going to be endless good people to run for office and serve in office. And that they're going to be able to learn the bureaucracy of government. But I'll end right there.
Well, let me challenge the panel on the point you were raising about GMOs. I mean, does someone want to jump in on the whole issue of participation in setting of risk or making decisions? Because what you're really arguing is that they're making informed decisions, but I mean, Paul might come back and say that those kind of genetically modified organisms are not necessarily risky. It's much more the Frankenstein kind of myth that people might be doing. But I mean, please, anybody do jump in on that issue, since I think it's fairly timely.
Well, I think I kind of agree with your point in the sense that, although I've always been in kind of an odd position with respect to GMOs, because I actually don't think that in comparison with a lot of what we do in agriculture, they're particularly dangerous, which makes me very unpopular among some of the groups that are protesting GMOs. But I also think that they should be labeled, which makes me very unpopular with all of the biotechnology companies. And the reasons I think that they should be labeled is I think that people have a lot of values, some of which relate to risk and uncertainty, but others have to do with various kinds of solidarity and religious values, and any number of these things could have a bearing on whether they want to eat genetically modified foods. Now, it would be a longer conversation to get into why that they're labeled in Europe and they're not labeled in the United States. It's a complicated government and cultural story, but we certainly have survey after survey which shows that people have very little knowledge of the fact that whether or not they're consuming GMOs in the United States. And one of the reasons why the biotech industry spends millions of dollars anytime that there's any state that puts a labeling ballot initiative up is because I think the industry fears what would happen if labeling came about. So I think there are good reasons why people should be put in a position where, when it's possible for them to make individual decisions about which technologies they're going to use and which they aren't, that we put in place the kind of policies and the kinds of institutions that allow them to do that. So that I think is kind of where I would stand. It continues to be a fairly uncomfortable place to stand because I don't have any friends. But I like you, Paul.
Other comments on the panel? We have plenty of hands out here. I think there's a number of them.
I guess I'm intrigued by Dr. Craig's thought about technology and that no one reflecting on it. And I have a question for the group here. Have anyone under 30 seen the movie Her yet? I guess I saw it and I was horrified, and I thought it was the first time that maybe people would reflect and think about what we're doing. But maybe I'm showing my age. Would you mind telling me, did you love it? Did you think it was great? Did it make you think or no? Sorry to put you on the spot here.
Sorry. I liked it, but I don't think I necessarily shared your fears about technology, because I thought technology was being used more to illustrate kind of like the human condition that was going on in there. I didn't really, maybe I might be wrong in my interpretation, but I didn't really think the technology was supposed to, while it might scare you when you were seeing, I kind of made me reflect more on what it means to be a human opposed to, what is technology really moving towards.
Well, comments from the panel or Dr.?
I'll just go out there. One thing I'll say, I mentioned Sherry Turkle's fine book, Alone Together. It's very interesting. One half of the book is on the transformation of our sort of ordinary lives, personal lives, by digital communication technology. First half of the book, however, is about empathetic robots and the increasing use of artificial, little small, simple AI creatures to provide comfort to people in nursing homes or for rehabilitation purposes, to trick kids into getting their vaccines, and various ways that we use robots to do this. And she basically sort of suggests that the future of falling in love with robots is not that far away. When I first read the book, I said, this is completely ridiculous. Humans will never go there. I've seen a bazillion movies and read a bunch of sci-fi about this. This is silliness. I'm only interested in the second half of the book. And then this movie comes out, and everybody's talking about it, and they think it's charming and delightful, and people are, my student here, Corey, is rethinking what it is to be a human because somebody's talking to their phone all the time. Yeah, I'm with you. That's crazy.
Other comments on that? No? Another question? Here we go.
This question is for Professor Craig as well. You touched on distanciation, which is a very big theme in globalization. And I was wondering, out of curiosity, if you think that this advancement in technology, which encourages this distanciation, is what is driving globalization, or if it's vice versa. Additionally, I was also wondering, you touched on how while we are beginning to undervalue the concept of personal face-to-face interaction, we're becoming more networked in informational technology, and I was wondering how you think this would affect future societal structure.
Well, the first point, can she hold the mic for a second so that she can tell me a little bit what she means more by distanciation?
Distanciation is the disappearance of space and time boundaries that is perpetuated by technology.
Yeah, right. So, right, it's a critical driver of globalization, especially at, you could say, the ideational level. How it is that we come to believe and profess to understand ourselves as, say, citizens of the world. We're not Stoic philosophers. We mean by that something very different, which is that we've been somehow, we're free of the confines of particular space in a way that humans haven't been before. And we're free to forge meaningful associations with other human beings, irrespective of political association, citizenship, locality, and so on and so forth. And I think that, again, at a deeply personal level, this really transforms us as political creatures. Many people have observed that I think this is an important driver of globalization. No, did you want to push on that further, or let me just say, two quick things about it. I think there are limits to it. I really think that, and this probably connects to what you said, your follow-up question about how networked can we be, and what are the prospects of something like a meaningful networked political, that the network revolution transforms political practice and our experience as citizens. Well, I think that there are certain limits to that. I think that what one would see is the extent to which we give ourselves over to especially virtual communication through various kinds of devices, that it will actually further exacerbate the tendencies that a couple of questioners have mentioned about the decline of our sense of ourselves as citizens. Civic engagement will probably decline to the extent that it's technologically mediated. It ceases to be the real thing that it is when you're face-to-face with somebody who deeply disagrees with you across the table, when it is conducted through the screen. That's my hunch, and so that there's a certain limit to which it's meaningfully political. It becomes something else at that point in time. And so my ultimate concern is that it will be in a kind of democratic enthusiasm, giving ourselves over to our devices, we'll actually find ourselves radically depoliticized and probably having lost, importantly lost some degree of self-government. So I think that would be my fear about it. I don't know, others probably have.
Yeah, I'd like to add here, because I think, touching on some of the things that Larry was saying, there is a politics here that we're not discussing very much, and it's the politics of standards. Mm-hmm. The way all of these devices perform is defined by hundreds of standards, thousands of standards in the case of something like a cell phone or a tablet, or the various codes for moving data back and forth across an internet. Those standards can be designed so that they facilitate secure commerce. Those standards can be designed so that they facilitate the National Security Administration monitoring everything that we're doing. I typically send them my cash receipts just in case they miss it.
So what you're saying? Just cash?
But all of the various ways that they can be, the standards can be configured so that they facilitate a great deal of anonymity and ability to conceal oneself from detection. And the place where the real politics of the future is being settled and has been settled for the last 20 years are in the international bodies that write those standards. And unfortunately, or very often, the people that write those standards, that's the last thing that they're thinking about. They may be strategic enough that they're thinking about some advantage for their particular corporation or technology platform that they're promoting, but they're rarely thinking about the broader political configuration that these standards are essentially defining.
Other comments, panel?
I was just going to point out that when we say we have to keep in mind, and this is probably obvious, but I'll just point it out anyway, that we means people in industrialized countries who are networked with all of these devices. So the we that I'm talking about in my work, they can't see, and they're subsistence farmers, so they're not going to be using these types of devices anyway, and they're left out of these sorts of decision-makings about standards, which might have major effects on their lives and the types of crops that they're able to grow, et cetera, but they're completely left out of the discussion.
Well, they are left out of the discussion, but they're also using cell phones much more widely than they're used in the West.
Well, because they leapfrogged. My work in South Africa, I saw more cell phones in South Africa than I did in the United States because they never put in landlines. Because the townships had no landlines, so automatically they went straight to cell phones because the because technology was possible. But let me ask a question, because the question you're really raising, and I would challenge the panel, or the kind of a reframing just slightly of your question. By the very nature of setting standards, it means that you set what is and what isn't. So in Logan's case, if the West was to turn around and say, no, you have to use this form of cataract surgery and you cannot use the other form of cataract surgery, number one, it exempts a whole group of people from access. But it's that unitary line again. It's that idea that there's a certain things that are along technological imperatives and that they cannot be shifted, and so that they end up being kind of foregone conclusions. The powerful remain powerful, the powerless remain powerless, and that the haves and have-nots are technological by its very nature, and it becomes this kind of world set with the patina of standards, right? Or against risk well, that's an unacceptable risk, and so forth. So anybody want to jump?
Yeah.
Larry?
Well, I mean, I think your point is quite well taken. The standard-setting bodies, whether we're talking about national ones or we're talking about the International Organization for Standardization, the ISO, which is located in Geneva, these standards bodies have been around for mainly since the end of the Second World War, have pretty much been confined to the U.S., Western Europe, Japan, Australia. And the so-called developing world has been largely left out. There's been quite a bit of discussion of late, because it's become apparent to the Chinese that they need to be at the table when these decisions are being made, and they've actually worked very, very hard to do that. I'll give you a couple of examples. The Chinese were the first country in the world to come out with a set of standards for nanotechnologies. The Chinese are working very hard on standards for the so-called Internet of Things, and the Chinese are embroiled in a huge dispute with the United States that probably no one in this room's heard of, over cotton standards. Now you might say, well, why in the world cotton standards? Well, the catch is that the U.S. machine harvests most of its cotton, and when you machine harvest cotton, you wind up tearing it up, right? The fibers get shorter. The Chinese harvest most of their cotton by hand. So the fibers are longer, which means it makes better quality clothing. However, the current standard was set up with the U.S. as the dominant cotton producer, and as a result, the length of the strands is not part of the standard. There are other things that are part of it, but that's not one of them. So the Chinese are involved in this rather significant dispute over just exactly how cotton is going to be defined. And this goes back to Paul's point, and the one that I made earlier. Standards make realities. They're not merely curious things that occupy filing cabinets and bookshelves. Standards make realities. So just ask yourself before or after you leave this room, how many things in your life are standardized, and how much effort would be required to change those standards. And you'll be astounded at the amount of effort that would be required. Once certain kinds of things are put into place, they're almost impossible to change. Think of the fact that we use 110 electricity, whereas most of the world uses 220. 220 is much more efficient. But once we started wiring the U.S. for 110, that was no longer a possibility. We'd be talking about hundreds of billions of dollars to make a transition from 110 to 220. And that's just one very, very minor point.
Other comments from the panel? Well, let me take one last question, because the fact that we're actually going to turn into pumpkins at some point tonight. We've got one way in the back, Stephanie.
Oh, she's got the mic.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Well.
I
have a loud voice, it's fine.
Okay, they can hear
All
you.
right, well, to be the third person to pile upon it, this one is also for Professor Craig, but I think it can reflect on the theme of the entire panel. Are the issues or questions surrounding technology, or even technology itself, can technology be separated from the human condition, or is it just as much a part of us as standing upright?
Yes or no?
Think of it as evolution in action.
I mean, this is obviously such an enormous and difficult question. I think, it's hard to even know how to try and put a handle on it. I think there is an important, I'll just say, I think there's an important difference between tools and technology. I think that a person can think their way to that distinction. It won't be precise. You will, of course, find devices or implements that straddle the divide. So one could grant the sort of classical Prometheus argument that we are or have been burdened with the blessing of being tool-making and tool-using creatures without yet saying that we are essentially technological. So one way that I would try and sort of open the question up a little bit might be to suggest that. But this is an enormous and very difficult question, and I think it's one that, again, it serves the purposes of the panel. If I can just sort of completely dodge it and say, think about it with yourselves. How would you just differentiate between the artful use of something that is emphatically yours, your hand, from picking up a stick and using that for a deliberate purpose, to refashioning the stick so that it can perform a more specialized purpose, to, so on down the road, holding in your hand a machine that none of us understand how it works, couldn't repair it if our lives depended on it, casts a spell over us because it appears to us as essentially magical, and yet, as it says, transforms our inner lives in remarkable ways. I don't know.
Other comments from the panel?
Let me just recount a story that I got from one of my friends who's a Japanese philosopher of technology, and heard him give a paper a couple of years ago about the, actually 2 years ago almost exactly, about the Fukushima accident. And in his paper he showed a photograph. I'm just going to take what he said as true. It may not be true, but I'm going to take it as true. He showed me showed us all a photograph of a monument on the site that has apparently been there for something on the order of 400 years. And it's a monument that says at the base, along with some other kind of quasi-religious inscriptions, "This is where the tsunamis come. Don't build below here." And of course, the nuclear plant was built well below where the monument was, right? Now, it's kind of tempting, to get to your question, it's kind of tempting to blame that kind of stupidity and hubris on something technological. But in fact, humans have been making those kinds of spectacularly stupid and hubristic decisions as long as we have history. So in many respects, this is just, the Fukushima accident was just a sort of interesting way of interweaving a technically complex decision with some fantastic technical expertise and some fantastically complex political decision-making to come up with a result that really just replicates what we come to think of as human nature.
Other comments from anyone else on the panel? Any last statements from anyone? Well, I have one quick announcement, and then I'm going to ask us all to give this wonderful panel a round of applause. We're going to return to this room on Tuesday, April 8th for our next and last of the semester Sharper Focus Wider Lens. There are save the date flyers next to the cookies that say the topic is what divides us, what unites us. And it's one of the Sharper Focus Wider Lenses that are being done as part of the 60/50 project on this campus, looking at the 60th anniversary of Brown, 50th anniversary of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, a year-long conversation about civil rights and human rights on this campus and in the surrounding communities. So I would welcome you back at that time. But let us give this wonderful panel of faculty a round of applause. Now, if you have further questions, come on up, and then we'll start playing the Jeopardy music so that they have to give their answers in the form of a question. So thank you so much for coming. We'll see you on April 8th.